Thanks, Jerome. There are three things that have put us here today in this positive position. Firstly, fast and thorough contact tracing, which built a ring fence around social, casual, household contacts. Obviously the lockdown, which stopped any further spread in some of our riskiest settings like gatherings in the home and in dining venues. And then the commitment of every Victorian to follow the rules and stay COVID safe, including those 40,000 people who've been quarantining as primary and secondary close contacts. With each of those components working together, we're here on the cusp of containing our second Delta outbreak, this one being a really significant one with close to 200 cases. But we can't call it mission accomplished yet. We can't forget that the Kappa outbreak in May kicked off 13 days after the Woollett case from South Australia. We had 13 days with no indication of cases, and then a really significant challenge in that Kappa outbreak that had a Delta outbreak to manage in the middle of it. What we can do is take some cautious steps forward following our hard reset. Let me make a number of points around the directions that I intend to sign, which are outlined online. You won't, as the Premier said, you won't need a reason to leave home. When you do leave, you can travel any distance in Victoria. And so although you can't visit homes, if there are loved ones that you haven't seen, see them in a park, go for a walk outside, wear a mask and catch up with them. But please don't visit homes. That rule's very important. That's where 80% of transmission's happening in Sydney right now. It's where most transmission happens in normal circumstances. And we've seen it from the most recent days where cases turning positive now have been the household contacts of our existing cases. So the restrictions on gatherings in the home remain. You can't have people over. Masks will still be required indoors and out unless an exemption or exception applies. That's the simplest thing we can do. It is very effective. In places like retail settings, in hospitality settings, at religious gatherings, it's good to welcome people back, but you do need to check in everywhere and every time, and please don't attend if you're unwell. People will be free to visit the ski fields again, but due to the higher risk in these settings, and entry into Victoria's alpine resorts will require that COVID test 72 hours before you visit. So you need that negative before you go up to the alpine resorts. Schools are returning. If you have to wear a mask at school, you must. Workplaces can also return, though people should continue working from home if they can. And again, masks must be worn indoors in those offices. This is a greater step forward than we've had in previous outbreaks, but it's a step we can take as long as we're fulfilling our obligations to each other. In particular, that relates to all of those people in quarantine now. If you know someone who's quarantining or isolating as a case, send them an SMS, give them a phone call to thank them. They are doing the hard work for all of us in Victoria, and that's a really critical obligation for them to commit to and to finish. We have talked about the fact that you can get that negative test early on. You must do that 14 days of quarantine, get that final negative test and the clearance from the department before you can be released. But you have protected us all, and my thanks go out to you. You've given up your freedom that we can have the freedoms that we're starting with today. So we give you our absolute thanks, our respect and our gratitude. Finally, as the Premier intimated, there are changes to our border settings because our border with extreme risk zones needs to be as secure as possible to minimise the risk of further incursions. So from 11:59, those local government areas of Wagga Wagga, Hay, Lockhart and Murrumbidgee are excised from the New South Wales side of the cross-border zone. They clearly push deeper into New South Wales, and so they are at risk of potential cases emerging there. So residents in these LGAs have been able to use the border bubble arrangements without a permit, subject to conditions, but now they'll be subject to the conditions of that extreme risk zone, and so won't be able to enter Victoria without an exemption or without another valid permit, such as a transit or specified worker permit. We know that's going to impact people's lives. We will work with them to answer any questions that they may have. Enforcing that domestic border is not an easy task. We are tied together. There are still lots of people who need to move across for essential and accepted reasons, but we have to manage it to keep everyone in Victoria safe, because incursions, the outbreaks that occur from them, are much harder. They're harder for Victoria, they're harder for our cross-border residents, and so we have to ensure that these areas remain COVID-free. So just to finish, again, a huge thank you to everyone in Victoria, in particular for those many thousands of Victorians who are still going through their quarantine period. Please wait for that final phone call, negative test result, before you're released from quarantine, and then we can all take that next step. So thanks all.
Happy to take any questions you have.
Sorry, just to clarify,
Just explain what it is specifically about this outbreak that's allowed us to take these bigger steps. It is the more infectious Delta variant. How much has lockdown fatigue played into this decision making?
No, I think it's primarily that we've tracked every single link for every one of these almost 200 cases. Hasn't happened in an outbreak of this size in Australia before. Maybe I'm not aware of it happening anywhere. It may have. The fact is we know where every single transmission's occurred, every single exposure site, and so we've identified those primary close contacts and their secondary close contacts, and they're all in quarantine. So it's really having that public health response around all of those at-risk individuals, and that's why we've emphasised several times today those obligations for people who are primary close contacts, because we know about you, we can control this if you do that full 14 days of quarantine and get your negative test before you release. So yes, it's highly infectious, but if you're quarantining, if you're only going out in the community again when you've got that negative test and we've picked up the phone to you, then there's no risk to the broader community. So it's really wrapping that public health response around every single case.
The restrictions around weddings and funerals are easing at the same rate this time around, 50 allowed at both. That was very different during the last lockdown. Has the health advice changed, given that we were told weddings were more of a risk?
They are more of a risk as an individual setting. They're still not as great as the gatherings for community sport, for example. But the confidence we have around managing these cases and allowing some of those other settings to have 100 indoors, 300 outdoors is for the reasons that I just provided to Bridget, that we're controlling those cases that we know are absolutely at risk. For the broader community, you need to follow your COVID safe rules, as it were, and the mask wearing and the constraints around density quotients and the like. But within those parameters, we think these things can go ahead. That's not to say that if you see someone who's symptomatic, send them home. If you're symptomatic, don't go out, get tested. But for those, pretty modest numbers, we think they can go ahead.
The US Centre for Disease, the CDC has found that PCR tests can't distinguish between the flu and COVID. Are we looking at that? Are we concerned about that?
Look, I think we'll look into it. It's not really an issue. When people have symptoms at the moment, they are primarily going to our testing sites to see if they have COVID. We have got virtually no flu in Australia. Like last year, there is virtually no flu to be found. If someone tests positive, it'll go through a quality assurance process to make sure that it's absolutely and unequivocally a positive test. I've heard nothing from our reference laboratories that our PCR tests do anything other than pick up with enormous sensitivity the COVID virus.
Do you see a role for rapid antigen tests in going forward, especially for those major events, hospital visits, aged care settings, etc.?
There are issues with rapid tests. Yes, you can get them rapidly, you can turn that result around. When you've got a very, very low prevalence, when you've got virtually none or you're confident you've got no virus out there, the false positives that occur become much more common because almost everyone has no virus, and so when you get a positive result, it's almost certainly wrong.
Don't use it in conjunction with a PCR?
You could use it in conjunction with a PCR. So if you get a positive test, yes, it's useful to exclude that person, to refer that individual and their sample for formal PCR testing. That's possible. Again, it's not as sensitive as a PCR test, so there'll be some there'll be some false negative results as well. So there'll be some people who might actually be infectious who turn up a negative result. You don't want those individuals to be in those settings.
It is approved by the TGA, a lot of these tests.
It is, and TGA approvals always give that context around where they're most effective to be used, where the sensitivity and specificity of the test works best. And so we have to bear that in mind. And in a virtually COVID-free environment, they have less of a role than that gold standard PCR that tells you with huge levels of confidence that you're negative when you're negative and you're positive when you've got that positive result.
What's your feeling with, I asked the Premier this earlier.
And that's where we farewell viewers on the main ABC channel in WA. If you want to continue watching this, you can do so on the ABC News channel.
Best. We have to reflect on every challenge that Delta's thrown us through this outbreak, and that's going to be the case ongoing. So it's under constant review. We won't be able to have some of those pinch points that led to the AAMI transmission, and we'll need to think about exactly how people are seated and separated and get up for food and toilets in those larger crowds as well. So it's a bit of work to work through, but we have to make sure that we're not undergoing a giant contact tracing exercise and we're going to lockdown because a single event's taken place.
And just on a bit of a tangent, can tradies enter the home at the moment? Visitors are banned, but can tradies come into your home if you need to?
We'll come back to you on that.
Thanks.
Ski fields, a lot of them are shared lodges, shared amenities. What are the restrictions around those?
So in terms of a booking in the accommodation setting for your bedroom, for your room or chalet, within a chalet, it's just your household. So there's no other household that can come together with you. You can't invite a friend over. You can't invite someone who's not normally part of your household. For those shared amenities, there are COVID-safe plans, COVID-safe rules that need to apply there. So there'll be density quotients. There'll be a need to make sure that the cleaning and separation takes place. But the accommodation is really a reflection of that private gathering limit.
What about weddings? What will they look like in terms of dance floors, etc.?
So it's 50, and really we're talking about masks, except for the purpose of photography, as I understand it, but to be fully defined today.
I think every parent in Victoria's relieved school can go back. Are you thinking about any possible changes to the school settings given how highly impacted schools were in this outbreak?
Yeah, we've certainly had further conversations. The Department of Education and Training have always reflected on the things that they can do. You know, the days are pretty cold, but ventilation's important. Mask wearing for teachers, critically important. The way that teachers come together in a tea room or outside of the classroom also really important. And everyone needs to reflect on making sure that no one turns up symptomatic to school, kids or teachers. So, you know, that's a collective obligation, but DET is absolutely focused on that.
Can you see weddings going back to the 300 mark after the 2 weeks, or do you think as a baseline restriction that's pretty unlikely going forward?
Oh, we'll see when we get there. Yeah, really too early to say.
And just on Delta, it seems like there's a growing acceptance that the level of vaccination for herd immunity with the new variant is probably going to be higher because the R rate's higher. I don't know if you've put a number on it previously, but do you accept that number is going to probably be above 75 or 80 with Delta now?
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. It's a more infectious virus. You need higher vaccination coverage to drive that transmission potential down even further. And we've seen cases spike in Israel, the UK, many of the states in the US because of that Delta variant, despite the high or relatively high vaccination coverage. So we need to aspire to the highest possible vaccination coverage. We need to keep our fingers crossed for more vaccines for even younger kids to be approved globally and then through our TGA. But it's a good sign that the Pfizer vaccine's gone through the regulatory approval process and for review by ATAGI for kids 12 and above. That's another piece in the protection against Delta variant and any other variants that might come.
That probably pushes us well into next year with baseline restrictions then before herd immunity in Australia, right?
Herd immunity is theoretical at the moment. We need to see what we get to. Yeah, we need to aspire high. It's going to take longer with a more infectious variant, but it also emphasises that there are other measures.
This is where we welcome viewers on ABC TV. I'm Gemma Vaness, and returning now to Melbourne, where authorities have been giving a COVID update.
Are we going to be wearing masks forever if we can't reach herd immunity?
I don't know. That I hope not. You know, there are not just new variants coming. There are new vaccines under development. They're going to be tailored to the new variants as they arise, and they will have potentially much better activity, not just for protection from severe illness, but for that transmission potential. And so as they, and this is why mRNA production capability in Melbourne is so critical. What if that facility works on a vaccine for a new variant that is more protective than anything we've seen? That will change the herd immunity threshold and make it lower and much easier.
What do you make of the Grattan Institute pushing for the $1 million vaccine lottery?
$1 million?
The vaccine lottery the Grattan Institute was
I'm not sure. I think we need to keep open minds around all of the things that might incentivise people to get vaccinated. There are still, as we've said previously, there are still millions of people who are just waiting in the queue, really ready to get vaccinated. And for anyone who's thinking they should wait, I'd say come forward now. That urgency has been made clear through the New South Wales outbreak, and that's clearly what they're calling for in New South Wales. I'd say the same in Victoria. You don't know what challenges we'll face in weeks or months to come, and if you're eligible now, please come forward.
What do these rules mean for hospital visits, Brett?
Hospital visits are still constrained. We can give you the specifics, but it's really a limitation that we've seen previously.
And in terms of, I know not as many people in the community would care about what happens here in Parliament as well as in Canberra. Are you happy with MPs heading back to work next week, and same for travelling up to Canberra? We usually get a bespoke question and provide bespoke advice for Parliament, but there's every likelihood that if they have to return to work face-to-face that we can make arrangements to allow that to happen. Well, we'll see. We haven't had the question raised yet, and we'll work through it.
Squashing a Delta outbreak. Wasn't our last outbreak Kappa?
The last outbreak was Kappa. It's fair to say, Kappa is B1617.1. Delta is B1617.2. They share many of the same mutations. They are very similar in terms of their infectiousness. Delta has become the predominant global variant, and it's displaced Kappa, so we don't see so much how it behaves in the world. It's probably just a little bit less infectious, but the challenge was profound with Kappa, and we saw it. We saw how it moved. So we shouldn't say that we defeated an easy target in the Kappa variant. We did extraordinarily well to get on top of that, and there was a Delta outbreak in the middle of that that we also managed, and that wasn't just a few cases. That was a dozen or so cases between households and workplaces and school.
From international experience so far, like you mentioned Israel, where we saw a couple of weeks ago some health department data that showed that for the Pfizer vaccine, protection against serious illness remained high in the 90s, but that data showed that protection, let me rephrase, complete protection against getting the virus dropped down to 63%. So does this mean that, are we bracing ourselves for high transmission rates at some point? Is running Delta to the ground kind of a chimera, like an unattainable target?
Look, it's where we have to be right now. We have to be at a zero COVID state in Victoria with the vaccination levels that we have. If we're not, and we're trying to get back to the way of life that we want and appreciate, we would see tens of thousands of cases, hundreds of thousands of cases. So zero COVID or zero community transmission, as is the national strategy, is where we need to be right now. But the lessons from Israel and other places are pertinent. They have seen cases go from dozens to a couple of thousand per day now. But there's also good news there. They've still got daily deaths in single figures or thereabouts. And so there is great protection from hospitalisation and dying, and vaccination should be done for that reason and that reason alone, even if you can't drive transmission down as much as you would like. So it'll be a challenge from a transmission point of view, but the protection from illness is really important.
Absolutely. So we could have a scenario in the months ahead where we could tolerate some transmission when the vaccination rates would be high enough to protect against serious illness?
Of course, we're moving to a world where COVID will be part and parcel of how we live our lives. There are, before the last couple of years, there were an estimated 3,000 deaths from flu, from influenza every year. COVID is much more severe, maybe 10 times more severe than flu in terms of the number of deaths that you'd see. Australia could have seen 30,000, 50,000 deaths. So we'll need to manage it much more strongly. We'll need to be clear that a vaccine can protect us from huge numbers of deaths, but we'll have to accept that people will die, even vaccinated individuals will die because it is such a challenging virus. But we have to get to a point of getting over this first and then working through all of those vaccine developments and all those other measures before we can take the next step.
Premier, just quickly on another matter, if that's okay.
Sure.
A bit later in spot.